Well, I was working for Jack Anderson, the columnist, at the time, and I had done a story for the column about an ITT subsidiary getting a parking lot concession or some concession at the Kennedy Center, which was then being finished. And that made me sort of, in the loosest sense, the ITT guy in the office. And Jack Anderson got a ton of mail in those days. Just, of course, it was all snail mail. It was all, pre-email, and most of it was, a lot of it was tips that were worthless. A lot of it was crazy mail. A lot of it was just people writing to comment. But you had to look at all of it because every now and then there'd be a needle in the haystack. And one morning, Opal Ginn, who was Jack's assistant, who handled the mail, came in and she put a stack of stuff on my desk, and she said, pointed to one. There was one on top. She said, "You might want to take a look at that." It was from ITT. It was from the ITT office. And I opened it up, and there was this astonishing memo. It was the original ribbon copy of a memo written by a woman named Dita Beard at ITT to her boss in the Washington office of ITT, a man named Miriam. And the memo was all about the ITT antitrust cases that were pending in the Justice Department. It was all about the Republican convention, and it carried the unmistakable suggestion that in exchange for support from ITT for the convention in San Diego to the tune of some $400,000, which was justifiable by ITT because they had hotels there. They owned the Sheraton hotel chain. That would result in a settlement of the antitrust cases in terms that were favorable to them. And the most famous part of the memo was at the very end of it. It was a postscript, as I recall. It said, "Please destroy this, huh?" And there was a little penciled D next to her name. It was memorandum form, so it was to, from, and then next to her name was a little D. So that's how it came to mind. It sort of fell out of, and it was a blank envelope, unmarked. We don't know who sent it to us. We never have known, at least I never have. And that was how it all started. When you get a document like that, it looked okay, but you can't just run with it. It may be a fake. It was so astonishingly incriminating that, you had to be concerned that it might be a fake, and the only way that you could ever really establish its authenticity would be in a way that would be pretty well airtight, would be to get her to confirm it. So I called over to ITT and made an appointment to go see her, and I said I had a document that needed some explanation and context, and I didn't know what to make of it, and I've forgotten the exact details of what I said. I didn't give much away, and I went around to see her. She was just around, their office was just around the corner from ours, and I was shown into a conference room, and the ITT PR people were all in there and so forth, and she's sitting there at the table, and she's an extraordinarily colorful, crusty, sort of a curmudgeonly woman, well known in Washington, generally well liked, I think. And I showed her the memo, and I've forgotten what else I said. I didn't really know what to make of it, and we hadn't decided what to do with it, which was more or less true. And she said, "That's my own little D." I've forgotten what else she said, but she said that. And once she said that, it was pretty clear. And we made copies of it, and I followed the ITT guy in the other room, and I made sure I took back the original, and they got to keep the copies. And I don't remember. The hardest thing about that interview was restraining my excitement when she said, "That's my own little D," because I knew then we had the story. And then, of course, there was a series of subsequent events. She called me, asked me to come out to see her at her house out in Virginia, and I came out there, and she was tearful, and she had her doctor there, and we had this long interview in her kitchen in which she told me this long story about goings on at the Kentucky Derby, and
she's drinking while she's telling you that.
As it's been a long time, and I haven't refreshed myself on that. But as I recall, she probably was, and she was no stranger to a drink, I don't think. And so she told this fantastic story, which we subsequently reported in the context of attributing it to her, because it was a wild story about how all this stuff had happened at the Kentucky Derby and involved the governor of Kentucky, a Republican named Louis Nunn. And we broke the story in the column. We were very careful not to give away our intentions, because the column took 3 days to get published, or 2 or 3 days most places. It was sent out by mail, and it went by wire to some clients, but client newspapers all over the country, and the thing broke just at the time that Richard Kleindienst's nomination had been reported out to be Attorney General. He'd been the deputy, and it had been reported favorably out of the Senate Judiciary Committee. He wasn't mentioned in the stories, but for inexplicable reasons, he decided to ask that his confirmation hearing be reopened so he could come and rebut this story, which didn't mention him, which was one of the most, I remember Jack Anderson just shaking his head and saying, I can't believe this guy did this. And the result was a very public spectacle that amplified the story like crazy. And of course, we released copies of the document to everybody. Its authenticity was not in question at that stage, so the story just exploded. And the hearings were, although there was no television coverage of them except out in the hall, the hearings were a huge story, and it went on for days and weeks, and the Democrats on the committee dug into it and asked a million questions, and they eventually interviewed Dita Beard in her hotel in Denver. She fled Washington. Nobody knew where she was, and it later turned out that the members of the plumbers unit in the Nixon White House I guess Gordon Liddy's the one who spirited her out of town, and then Howard Hunt, wearing a now famous ill-fitting red wig, visited her at the hospital in Denver. This all came out, I've forgotten the sequence, but it all came out later, but it was a particularly sort of ludicrous episode. And eventually we all went trucking out there because a subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee went out to interview her in her hospital room, and it was hilarious in a way because she was at an osteopathic hospital, which is a peculiar place to go if you're suffering from angina, which is what her problem was. And I imagined that it must have been the hospital near the airport or something, because she was supposedly stricken on the airplane. Well, it turned out to be in the midst of this enormous gleaming complex of the most modern medical facilities in the state. And here's this little, tiny little bone hospital where she was housed with a couple of doctors that I would not have let cut my toenails. These guys were strange characters, at least they seemed that way to me. And they had the hearing, and she got the vapors in the middle of the questioning, and they had to leave, and it was high drama. It went on for a while, and she started denying that she denied that it was her memo. She denied that she'd confirmed it to me. She denied all these things. And for a while, that became the story, her denial. And then the spotlight was back on us as to what we could further show, and we kind of told our story. And I had a lie detector test, and we challenged her to do the same, which of course she never did. And then finally it all came crashing down because a reporter for the Copley newspapers out in San Diego had done an interview on other subjects, mostly with a guy named Bob Wilson, who was a Republican congressman from San Diego and a friend of Dita Beard's. And near the end of this interview, which he happened to be rolling a tape recorder on, he said, "What about this?" After asking about other things, election season, and so he asked him, "What about this Dita Beard, this ITT memo? What do you make of that?" And he said, "Well, she told me it was, Jack Anderson had the original. She said, she was worried about the fact he had the original." And a guy named Walter Gordon of the Baltimore Sun had gone out to San Diego to nose around and ended up talking to the reporter who did the story, and the Copley papers had not run this information, but Walter Gordon ran it, the Baltimore Sun ran it, and at that point it was all over. Bob Wilson was called to testify. The fact that she'd confirmed the authenticity of the document to him became known, and the whole thing kind of blew up. Kleindienst was eventually confirmed, although it later came to be known that he had not told the truth in his testimony, and he was pleaded to a lesser offense, and he could have been charged with perjury. He pleaded to something like giving incomplete information or something like that. So I was making a talk at a college out in Illinois, and I was telling the truth. I knew I was telling the truth. Most reporters, I think, who knew me knew that I'd been telling the truth because nothing else really made any sense. On the other hand, it was now an active controversy, and truth is a powerful thing, but it's much easier to remember, and it tends to get out. But you had what we later learned was a John Dean run operation designed to discredit this story was going. We could tell the White House was involved in it, although we couldn't say specifically who was doing what. And there was some anxiety that the thing may be left up in the air. And I came back to my room after the talk, and I called home, and I got word that Bob Walters had called, and I called him immediately. Bob was a very good reporter for the Evening Star here in Washington, now defunct Evening Star. And he said, I got him on the phone, he says, "Hume, you're vindicated." And then he rolled out the whole story about Walter Gordon, and by that time the thing was hitting the wires and it was everywhere. And while I was vindicated in what I said, she was kind of discredited. She was discredited by the fact that she told me the memo was real, and she later took that back, and it turned out that she had told somebody very close to her that it was the real deal. So she got discredited, which allowed Kleindienst to skate past and be confirmed as Attorney General. Only later did the whole thing unravel. But, their suspicions about it persisted, even though he kind of got past it. The outcome in a sense was disappointing because, at the time I thought obviously there was some fire underneath all that smoke, and we never quite knew what it was. And so